Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net, and it's time for another cheat sheet review session. Let's start with lesson number 37, where we talked about utilizing the Visual State Manager to create adaptive triggers. We said that the Visual State Manager will utilize triggers in order to manage the states of the various elements inside of our XAML and allow us to modify properties of those elements based on the screen size. So here I've given you a little cheat sheet that you can copy and paste every time you need a Visual State Manager. Yeah, you can get rid of the adaptive triggers, you can rename the visual states, you can change the setters to whatever you need in order to make this work for you, but essentially here you go. You've got a great little start here. Remember that we're creating a visual state group which will contain one or more visual states. We can give the states any name we want. We can set the triggers at any size, height, and width that we want to manage or to handle for our specific application's needs. Now again, I think I've said this a couple of times already, I'm not aware of any specific breakpoints or viewport sizes that we should be using in every single app. It really is up to your specific application and what you need. So you can modify the state triggers and the setters for each visual state. You can see here I've got two states, a narrow and a wide. And so anything lower than 600 pixels will trigger off these setters, and anything over 600 pixels will trigger off these setters. Okay, pretty simple concept. Just need to expand on that and change things about your application by adding more setters based on what you need for your specific application's layout. All right, then in the very next video, in lesson number 38, all I did was just kind of show you a technique that I stole, that I credited to the guys at Wintellect, Jeff Prosise specifically, that allowed us to create adaptive triggers that listen for screen sizes and then set the grid.row and grid.column on specific stack panels that contain the actual content, moving them over from a more wide layout to a more narrow layout that required a scroll viewer. And so you want to review that or even riff on that idea. That's probably a good way to go about it. Now we said this isn't necessarily a completely different way of approaching it, but you can also create device-specific views in addition to your adaptive triggers. And so this would allow you to create views for specific devices. In this case, we can create two folders at the root of our project, and one would be called device family -mobile. The other would be device family desktop, and then we can add in a series of pages, and at runtime it will determine which device we're running on and use those pages appropriately. You can also leave the pages in the root of the project directory and just append on these suffixes .devicefamily-mobile.xaml or devicefamily-desktop.xaml. That might be helpful if you only really have one or two pages and you don't want to complicate it by adding folders. And then I gave you a good resource to learn more about this approach from Igor's website. Okay, next up we talked about data binding, and I said that basically data binding allows you to bind a list of data, so a list of POCOs, into a control that knows how to render that content. Now I just demoed the grid view and the list view controls, but the combo box can also be utilized this way as well, and maybe a few others. Let me paste in the code example. Here I have the XAML that would be required. First of all, I'm adding a namespace called data that points to a subfolder called models in my project, where I'm going to keep the classes that'll be utilized throughout the rest of this project. Then you can see that I've created a grid view down here, and I've set the item template equal to a static resource named book data template. Now each instance of book in the books collection will be rendered using this data template that's defined here in the page resource section. Here I just have a stack panel with an image and 2 text blocks. You can see that I referenced individual properties of a given POCO object, in this case the book object, in order to bind them to those properties to the given XAML control that I need. So in this case, an image control, I'm going to want to get the path to images and set that equal to the source. And for the text blocks, I would want to grab, for example, title and author and set them as the text properties for the text blocks. Okay. And then one other thing that I want to point out here is actually what kind of you need to do in the code behind. And I wanted to show 2 things here. First of all, kind of how I went about actually getting a list of books. I created a book manager class in that project that we looked at, and it's responsible for returning back instances of book in a list of book. And so then by having it as a property of my page, I can then bind to it here in the XAML. But the other thing that I did, you'll remember, is that in the grid view itself, I wanted to handle a click event for a specific item, so that when somebody clicks on an item, I want to be able to handle that event. So first of all, I have to enable the click event, and then I want to set a handler for that item click. And here I'm actually handling that item click event. I'm going to use the item event click args to get that item that was clicked on and then cast it to type book. Now that I have it as a type book, I can grab off any of the properties that I need and work with them that way. And now the final, well, actually not the final lesson. Let's talk about this simple lesson first. I said that, list of book is great, but really if your contents are going to change inside of that collection, you need to use a different type of collection. You need to use the observable collection. Okay. And now, finally, we talked about kind of combining some of these ideas together. For example, if you intend to use data templates in your application for grid view, list view, combo box, whatever the case might be, and you think you're going to want to modify the sizes of items in data templates, then you need to break out of defining it in the page itself. You need to put the data template into its own user control, and then inside that user control you can create a visual state manager with the various states and triggers and so on. So we demoed this, and it was I think a 5-step process. So let me just kind of copy and paste all this down here. Okay, so step 1 is you're going to need to add a user control to your project and give it a good name. Then you're going to cut the content out of the data template in like your main page.xaml and paste it into that user control. Then you want to reference that user control from inside the data template. So whatever you removed from the data template, now you're going to replace it with the name of the user control that you created. In this case, I called my user control the contact template, so I would want to reference it like so. And I added these other properties as well. I'm not sure you need them, but you can reference them in case you need to make sure that your control stretches the entire available area. All right, next up then, in the user control, we need to make a change to all the XBind statements that you previously already had. You need to add on the object.property notation. So if it's a contact class that you're working with or a book class, and you need to put contact or book dot and then the name of the property that you're going to actually bind to. And then the last thing that you need to do back in the user controls code behind is to make a public property that you can reference from the user control that will be, an instance of the POCO itself, right? So in this case, a contact property of type contact from the models folder that I created, and you're going to return the data context, and the data context is whatever is being passed in from main page.xaml to your user control and providing the context of data that it will actually utilize, and it'll be of type whatever it is that's being passed in. In this case, it's a contact, could be a book, whatever your POCO object is. Finally then, in the constructor for the user control, you want to add this line of code which will essentially handle the data context changed event for the user control, and it will call using a lambda statement to call the bindings.update, which will tell it, hey, refresh yourself, we've got data. Okay. and you can use all of this or most of it actually as what I've been calling boilerplate code, and that's a great reason to have this cheat sheet laying around so you can just grab the code you need and paste it into your project and make a few modifications to it. Okay, so that's all we talked about in the previous, 6 lessons or so. Pretty meaty stuff, but not terribly hard, right? We took it in bite-sized pieces. And you're going to use many of these concepts in the challenge, and it will be challenging. It'll probably take you a couple of hours at a minimum to pull this off. So there's no excuse for not going through the challenge. You need the challenge to force you to struggle, to really cement these ideas in your melon. Okay, so we'll pick it back up in the next lesson, the next challenge. Thank you.